clicking on conferences and training, which is on the right side, and then there will be a drop-down menu where you can press webinars. And all of our webinars, including this one, are up there in date order. You can also register for upcoming ones. So this is the first part of our three-part opioid crisis webinar series. In this one, we are going to be speaking about the research that shows there is a large unmet civil legal need, as well as research that shows that civil legal aid is uniquely positioned to help. And then we will go over federal funding opportunities that can support your work in this. Please feel free to answer questions throughout the webinar. You can do this by going to the Q&A box on the bottom right side of your screen and sending us a question. We will have time both for questions throughout the webinar in between speakers, as well as dedicated Q&A time at the end. Great. So moving along, my name is Casey Chiappetta. I work here at the NLADA in the Legal Services team. And with me, I have Karen Lash, who is the former Executive Director of the White House Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, and the current Director and Practitioner in Residence at the Justice and Government Project at American University. Please feel free to contact both of us at the emails below, and our emails will also be listed throughout. Today's agenda, we are going to be providing information about the legal needs related to opioid use disorder, OUD. You will also be interchangeably calling it SUD, which is substance use disorder, and how legal aid can help. We will be talking about various topics, where to find data, federal funding, and then some resources that you can use that we've put together to help you out. If you just give me a second, I'm going to message a few people who can't connect to the audio. All right, so now we are going to move along onto the substantive part. So OUD and SUD have ripple effects throughout the community. It is often not confined just to one individual or one family. Communities are impacted economically and socially when their community members' lives are destabilized. So while 2.1 million individuals have an opioid use disorder, this extends to 11.8, or it extends beyond to about 11 million Americans who are impacted by an OUD. As we go through, I'm not going to be reading all of these points because there's a lot of text on the slides. We're hoping that you can use these slides as a resource when compiling your own data, your own grant narratives, and so forth. All of the links work, and you can access them on the slides on the NLADA webinar page, and then they are also listed out at the end of each section. So that way, if you don't feel like doing that, or if you just want to go straight on, you can type in the URL as well. So while there are approximately 2 million people with OUD or SUD and more are impacted, you are likely serving and working with these populations who have been affected by the opioid crisis, even if you aren't necessarily identifying them as such. For example, your work around domestic violence, guardianship, kinship care may be relevant and may apply. You may be able to apply it to your work with opioids. With opioids, there's a lot of overlap with other legal needs. The legal needs aren't just related to drug use, but it also points, again, to this ripple effect throughout the community, something that we're going to keep coming back and touching on. The legal problems of people with OUD and SUD generally fall into 4 categories: family, health, housing, and employment. These categories often are overlapping, and self-reinforcing. So as we will cover later on, an issue, a housing issue may turn into a family issue if there are issues with moving houses, potential abuse, absence, or child protective service involvement. I'm just going to message a few more people and let them know how to connect to the audio because there's still some issues. Okay, so continuing. For the last 20 years, the use of opioids for chronic non-cancer pain, which is what opioids were first used for, has increased, and so has misuse. The figures on this slide reflect that. I am going to go in a little bit in depth on the third point here. For children between ages 1 and 5, methadone accounted for almost 20% of opioids ingested, and this parallels general figures. Methadone is less than 5% of all prescribed opioids, but accounts for 30% of opioid-related deaths. That does not necessarily that's not necessarily connected to medication-assisted treatment, which methadone is often used for. It might be that methadone, which can be obtained illicitly, children might be able to find it in the house, ingest it, and then end up in the emergency room. All right, so it looks like some people have been able to connect audio. Congratulations and welcome to the webinar. So how can legal aid improve health? So SAMHSA identifies health, home, purpose, and community as areas critical to managing life in recovery. Legal aid is uniquely positioned to help in pretty much all of those in a way that can provide wraparound services, referrals to other social service providers, and really help stabilize lives, both for those directly impacted by OUD and SUD, as well as the greater community. So the studies on this page reference medical legal partnerships, or MLPs. That being said, you can definitely apply these studies beyond that realm because MLPs address the underlying social determinants of health, which is where you work, live, play, and how that affects your health. So if you see, for instance, a study, and all of these studies have been peer-reviewed, you can definitely apply this to your own work. Let's say you're helping people access benefits or helping them stabilize their income. This is addressing a social determinant of health, and you can show very clearly that legal aid is improving health outcomes. Oh, and we have a question on bullet point number 2. Is this generally patients at an MLP or those with OUD? This specific study was for all patients at an MLP, not just those with an OUD. The National Center for Medical Legal Partnership has a really great resource that we're going to reference later about MLPs that are focused on opioid use disorder, and you can find some specific MLP figures related to that. Okay, so like the previous slide, each of these studies on the list has been peer-reviewed, showing that there is robust evidence base that shows people have unmet legal needs and that also legal aid can help. So if the main point from this slide is that if you're serving clients who have experienced abuse, it is likely that there is some overlap between opioid or substance use in your work. It is now up to you to make the link. And I'm going to put in a plug for our upcoming webinar. On October 24th, we are hearing from Legal Aid of West Virginia about how they collected data and fixed their screening questions so that they made sure they are collecting the data that they need to show that they are helping serve this population. which is something that we've had conversations with legal aid organizations in the past, that you are working to stabilize families, that you're already doing this work, but you might not necessarily be categorizing it as such, and this webinar is designed to give you the research and resources to help you make those connections, and the following one, how to ask those questions the best you can. So as I previously mentioned, SAMHSA identifies health, home, purpose, and community as areas critical to managing life in recovery. Legal aid by stabilizing families can definitely do that. The driving point here is that legal aid is critical in managing recovery and helping those in recovery stay in recovery. And your work is likely addressing these 4 critical areas. This is a particularly important point, is that the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York sent a letter explaining that MAT, or medication-assisted treatment, if it's prohibited by courts, it may violate the ADA. And we have another question popping in. What is the date and time of the Legal Aid West Virginia webinar? I don't know the time offhand. I believe it's at 3 p.m. on October 24th, but you can access the information on the NLADA webinar page. Individuals with OUD or SUD often experience employment-related problems, and opioid use, like others, is both a cause and a symptom of employment-related issues. And on this slide, you can see very clearly that it is. The research is clear that legal aid, when it comes to record clearing and addressing discrimination in the workplace, has the ability to help people find, secure, and remain in jobs. And several peer-reviewed studies on this page have demonstrated success. And the reason why I keep driving home the point that that these are peer-reviewed studies is because there has been a not so recent push, definitely an extended push, to focus on evidence-based practices and to show that your work actually works. So it's really important to bring in these studies and these facts and figures when trying to make your case, both to community partners, but to also policymakers, if you're doing that, as well as grant administrators. So like employment, housing and opioid or substance use are both intertwined and reinforcing the other. Substance use is both a cause and a symptom of substance, or housing-related issues are both a cause and a symptom of opioid and substance use. The evidence has shown pretty clearly that legal aid improves housing and stabilizes lives. It's been shown time and time again that when you have legal representation, which I'm sure is not a particularly shocking fact to many of you listening in right now, tenants are more likely to stay in their home, have more time before being evicted, and have needs such as maybe mold or a rat infestation addressed in a timely manner. All right, so here are some resources for you to learn more. As I previously mentioned, the National Center for Medical Legal Partnership has this really phenomenal brief about medical legal partnerships and how their work is focusing on opioids. So it profiles 4 different organizations and their work, and we will actually be hearing from one of them in the last webinar of this series. We will be hearing from Washoe Legal Services in Nevada, and we will also be hearing from Joshua Crabtree over at Legal Aid of the Bluegrass to talk about their recent work serving children who have been affected by the opioid crisis. This webinar's date has yet to be set, but it will be set very, very soon. You can also find Karen's and my special feature on opioids in the MIE Journal. In this, we provide many more resources than the ones that are listed in this webinar about making the link between your work and opioids, We also have a fact sheet, and then there's some other resources on here. The LSE's Opioid Task Force is a really good one to check out if you have not yet, and it's also mentioned in both their budget request and also the Justice Gap Report, the need to serve those who have been affected by opioids. As promised, here are the references. All right, so moving into the fun stuff of this webinar, we're going to be talking about federal funding. We've split this up into two different groups. So I will be talking about the direct discretionary federal grants, so those grants that come from the federal government to you or to a partnering organization who you may subgrant from or jointly apply to. And then we will also have Karen talk about federal pass-through funding, which she will go more into depth. But the main idea is that it goes from the federal government to the state, then to you. All right. So the first grant that we're going to be talking about is from Housing and Urban Development, Resident Opportunity and Self-Sufficiency. So this is designed to assist residents of public and Indian housing make progress towards economic self-sufficiency, which is defined as, quote, an individual's ability to support their household by maintaining financial, housing, and personal family stability. The estimated total program funding was $35 million with an award ceiling of about $720,000. There is, similar to the other grants discussed, express language for legal aid. So under the types of services to be coordinated, civil legal aid, civil legal assistance and expunging, sealing, or correcting criminal records of securing certificates of rehabilitation is listed as eligible. Eligible applicants for this grant are public housing authorities, so it's not civil legal aid organizations. Civil legal aid would be able to submit a joint application or subgrant from one of the PHAs. To apply, you should contact your area's public housing authority to see if they're planning on submitting an application. You can either submit it jointly or subgrant. And then one last note about this is the target population for this grant is public housing residents. You can read more at the link that has been listed or by typing in the URL listed at the bottom of the screen. All of these have been posted on Legal Aid Resources, which is the way that NLADA lets you know about these really cool and awesome federal funding opportunities that you can use to support your work. And it breaks it down, I like to think, pretty clearly. So the next grant I'm going to be talking about is the Rural Communities Opioid Response Program. So AmeriCorps is designed to help rural residents access treatment and move towards recovery. So this is, again, going back to one of SAMHSA's priority areas is treatment, prevention, and recovery, often which legal aid can make the case that they are part and a necessary partner in supporting and assisting someone as they remain in recovery. AmeriCorps is a 3-year program, and HRSA, which is the part of HHS that oversees it, envisions that recipients will leverage other resources to maximize their impact and sustain programs beyond those 3 years that are funded. This grant comes from HHS's broader 5-point strategy, which emphasizes evidence-based interventions and interventions that align prevention, treatment, and recovery. So again, highlighting the word evidence-based. Like the previous one, there is also express language for legal aid. The language for legal aid lists legal aid as a recovery core activity, which is pretty great, and we are very excited to see that. And then also in the list of additional resources, it includes LSC, the National Center for Medical Legal Partnerships, and lists more information about medical legal partnerships. So you can definitely see that there is express language for legal aid, and the federal government and HRSA is aware that legal aid is a partner and a necessary one in addressing this crisis. So moving outside of HES and HUD, I'm going to be talking about the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime, or DOJOVC. This grant enhancing community responses to the opioid crisis, serving our youngest crime victims. I will put a plug in for our date to be announced webinar that I previously mentioned with Joshua Crabtree. He will be talking about one of their projects, which was funded by this specific grant. So these projects, the 4 legal organizations that applied and were successful in their applications, work collaboratively with schools, law enforcement, health and social service providers, and other community partners. Civil legal aid programs in Kentucky, Ohio, Oklahoma, and West Virginia states that we are not surprised to see these projects happening because of the high rates of opioid use and substance use, are launching projects to provide legal help to children and their caregivers. The award for these projects was $300,000, and the ceiling was $2.5 million. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of things you can do with $300,000, or up to $2.5 million. It is important to note that there wasn't express languages for legal services in this grant. So unlike the previous 2 that had express language, either saying that it was a core recovery activity or saying that legal aid could explicitly assist with expungements or record clearing, there wasn't in this grant. However, there was supportive service language, so something along the lines of a strong link between crime victimization and substance abuse has been evident for some time, and these issues cannot be addressed in silos or by one discipline or agency, allowed these organizations to go ahead and apply, and clearly they were successful in doing it. So even if there's not express language, you can still do it. And then this one is the one that we are potentially the most excited for. So this is a grants forecast. Forecasted grants happen when grant-making agencies, pending budgetary or discretionary spending approvals and other program decisions, offer previews of their planned funding opportunities. So this one hasn't been announced yet, but like a little sneak peek of it has, to try and get people who are interested in applying to start thinking about their applications and what programs and projects they want to fund. The Justice and Government Project and NLADA have put together a grants forecasting guide where you can read more about how federal agencies make these forecasted grant decisions, how you can identify previous partnerships, tips for contacting them, and so forth. And you can access it at the link underneath the exclamation point. Because it's a forecast, there isn't a notice of funding opportunity or announcement, so we don't know exactly what services are going to be eligible or if there will be express language for legal aid, but it is quite possible, especially because this is one that is offered by HRSA. HRSA also oversees the one where legal aid is listed as a recovery core activity. So we are hopeful, and if there isn't express language for legal aid, you can take a play from the DOJOVC for legal aid organizations and still apply if there is language for supportive services. As we've seen, legal aid is very useful in thinking about prevention, treatment, and recovery. So with that, I am going to pass the mic on over to Karen Lash from the Justice and Government Project.
Terrific, Casey. Thank you so much for setting this up. And special thanks, actually, for saying yes to NLADA and joining Radika's civil justice team. The whole civil legal aid community is lucky to get you.
Thank you.
Okay. How do I advance it? Thank you. Okay. So I know this is dry stuff, but it does seem worth a very quick primer on The difference between the grants that Casey has already talked about that are relevant to responding to the opioid crisis and the ones that I'm about to talk about. So this graphic is to try to help make it visual. The next category of grants are all federal funds originally, but they are administered by, usually by the state, sometimes also local governments. And this way super simple, oversimplified primer shows how it starts. Congress passes a law, they establish a particular block or formula or open-end reimbursement. We're going to sort of summarize it either by calling it a block grant or a federal pass-through funding stream. And they say what its purpose is, they say which federal agency is going to administer, and then that agency is responsible for preparing published federal rules, typically, and other guidance, and generally overseeing that the states are spending those block grant funds consistent with the statute. The common denominators for this next set of grants include that the money goes by some kind of formula to all states, the territories, and the District of Columbia. States have sometimes a lot of discretion regarding lining up the federal restrictions on spending with their local priorities. Most of the money will end up with sub-grantees or sub-recipients like you all. The state's award is generally not competitive. In other words, so long as the state submits the application and they often have to submit some kind of state plan for how they're going to spend it, submit periodic reports to the federal agency, follow all the rules, they're going to get the money. And the last part of the common denominator is that the governor will pick the state agency or the actual administrator of the funds, typically wherever there is relevant expertise in the executive branch. This tends to vary state by state, kind of a Where's Waldo exercise to simplify that hunt. When we get there, it's slide 35. My project has prepared a grants matrix of all of these different federal block grants, pass-through funds that allow states to spend some of their funds on legal services. So it'll make it a lot easier to find who you're looking for. Okay, so these are the 5 funding streams that your state could use for legal services to respond to the opioid crisis. I've got slides, and I'm going to talk in a little bit more depth about the first 4, but I did at least want to put the 5th one on your radar. That 5th one is called Title 4E, which refers to the Social Security Act, the part of the Social Security Act that establishes the federal-state partnership for foster care in our country. And like the really big, exciting news is that very recently, the Department of Health and Human Services Children's Bureau, they changed their policy so that states can seek up to 50% reimbursement in federal funds for, wait for it, legal representation for children and parents in the child welfare system. So there's a high-level review of Title 4E in that grants matrix, so I encourage you to take a look. And if you're attending the NLADA conference, there will be a panel on 4E with me and Casey Allison Green from National Association of Council for Children, Bob Gillette from the Michigan Advocacy Program, and Michael Piggins from Legal Aid Society of Oklahoma. So stay tuned on more of OUDs, but now we're going to talk about the others. Now, because these funds are administered by your state executive branch, it's super important for you to do a little research on, so what's your executive branch leadership saying about the opioid crisis in your state, because you want to line up, you know, what you can do with those stated priorities, because those agencies that are administering these funds, they gotta deliver on what those policy priorities are. So here's just two examples, but that all hands on deck message is pretty typical. But you want to know what, you know, your governor and your executive branch leadership is saying. Okay, finally, this is the first of the 4 block grant sources we'll talk about. So this one is at the federal level is administered by Health and Human Services. An acronym, I'm sorry for so many acronyms. This one's SAMHSA. Sometimes I know them by their acronym and not even what they stand for. But SAMHSA stands for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. SAMHSA absolutely knows and communicates in a variety of ways the importance of multidisciplinary approaches and partnerships in addressing and helping people with substance abuse or opioid use disorders. And this particular block grant is absolutely no exception. And so they have signaled very clearly to the states, yes, you can use some of these funds if you choose, using as an example of partnerships, medical legal partnerships. There's also there's a companion grant to the substance abuse block grant, the mental health block grant. Both of those are in the grants matrix, and generally it's going to be the same state administrator that oversees and makes decisions about those block grants. Special kudos to Legal Aid of West Virginia, who Casey says you're going to hear from soon, because they used mental health block grant funds for a partnership with their schools, which is how they discovered that many of the families and kids who were having problems were having them because of an opioid use disorder, the family member, and that helped them in applying for that DOJOVC grant, the Enhancing Community Responses grant. So I always like pointing out when this stuff all connects up. Okay, the next block grant is called the State Opioid Response Grant, also administered by SAMHSA. There's no express legal services language in this one, but they also don't, you know, provide any kind of comprehensive, exhaustive list of the services. So we think, as Casey has said, that legal services absolutely can fall under the prevention and recovery services and activities. Okay, and then there's just more helpful language from the application that the states complete. I would specifically point out that reference to the state strategic plan, because you want to get your hands on it. This is what your state has told the feds they're going to do with those funds. So again, you want to line up what you can do to advance and support and be a partner to helping the state achieve those results. Shout out here to Vermont Legal Aid. They're the first that we know of, anyway, to tap SOR funds to provide legal help to people with a substance use disorder. And July of this year, under a grant agreement with the Vermont Department of Health Division and Alcohol and Drug Abuse Programs, they're establishing 3 MLPs with other recovery service providers to address the health-harming legal needs that constitute barriers to successful recovery. And they're doing it through biweekly office hours, trainings, and legal clinics. If anyone else has tapped into the SOR funds, or actually any of these block grant funds for opioid-related legal services, Casey and I want to know. Okay, the third one, you're probably all very familiar with AmeriCorps, starting in either 2017 or 2018. One of the 7 priorities in the Corporation for National and Community Services solicitation, or their notice of funding opportunity, has to do with this reducing and or preventing prescription drug and opioid abuse. So there's not legal aid language, but AmeriCorps has had a very long history of funding legal aid and court-based self-help services. So I'll preempt your what you're thinking, which is to just acknowledge that AmeriCorps can be a difficult program to administer, and you generally need to find some private money to effectively run the program. But those who are doing it tend to say it's well worth it. So back when I was at the Justice Department, I wrote 2 guides, one about AmeriCorps and the other about VISTA, which stands for Volunteers in Service to America. The guides are a little dated, but they still are useful, I think. They really describe how it all works and specific experiences of state courts and legal aid programs that really swear by it. So there's 2 different streams. There's national funds for multi-state applications, like what Equal Justice Works has done. But then every state has a commission for state, or allotment of funds for state-specific programs. And there are lots of examples in the AmeriCorps guide from California, from Montana, New York, and lots of other places. Quick shout out actually to Arkansas Legal Aid. They got one of the Rural Community Opioid Response Program grants, the AmeriCorps. I think it was Casey's slide 20. It was a planning grant, so not a lot of money, but they I think very ingeniously leveraged that planning grant by using their VISTAs. So their VISTAs did the outreach and interviewing and data gathering that helped support the AmeriCorps grant. Very clever. Okay, so this is the last of the block grants we'll talk about. I'm sure most people on this call are familiar, but a quick review of the Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA, Victim Assistance Formula Grant Program. So just a reminder that VOCA itself, the act, actually authorizes multiple grant programs. So some are developed and administered directly by DOJ's Office for Victims of Crime, like the slide 21 that Casey talked about, enhancing community responses to the opioid crisis. VOCA also authorizes funding to each state for victim compensation programs, but our focus is on the formula funds that go to each state for victim assistance, because it's just all about victim services. So in 2016, DOJOVC, they published a new rule that tells us all how states can spend these victim assistance formula funds. Was really intended to make the funds more flexible overall, and important for us, it expanded the forms of legal assistance that states could spend on. So it wasn't just emergency restraining orders anymore for domestic violence, it was all wraparound civil legal needs of for domestic violence, wage theft, consumer fraud. It's actually a very long list, recognizing the civil legal needs of victims of crime, but relevant for SUD and OUD related work. That list also includes child abuse and neglect and elder abuse, where we know we sadly are seeing both with people with an SUD. So you probably all also know already that starting in 2015, there was a really huge increase in these funds. They've been up and down a bit since fiscal year 2015, but they've really remained at elevated levels from the pre-2015 days anyway. So this slide shows you how to find information about your state, simplifying the Where's Waldo search. Really importantly, this is where you'll not only find your state administrator, but the report that your state submits to the feds, to the Office for Victims of Crime, about how they're using the money, what kinds of crime victims they're serving with the funds, all really valuable information for you as you explore that funding source. But want to also note here that Atlanta Legal Aid has tapped some VOCA formula funds for their Kinship Caregivers project. Significant, of course, because of the increasing numbers of caregivers who are taking care of the kids because a parent or a guardian has an SUD, and those numbers are growing. So kudos to Atlanta Legal Aid for expanding their program with VOCA. This is also an opportunity to explore partnerships with your courts. The courts are also potential grantees for the VOCA victim assistance, and in particular around kinship care. That could be a fruitful partnership. Okay, and here's that picture of the grants matrix that I keep referencing, where you'll find an overview of the federal pass-through funds administered by your state. There are handy jump links from the list of all of the block grants that we've identified that can include legal services, including the ones that we've talked about today. So if anyone else is tapping any of the block grants to support OUD or SUD related legal services, please let us know. And if you think that maybe the source of some funds you are getting from your state might be a federal block grant, I can help you figure it out. It's really important to know the source of the funds that you're using for a variety of reasons. So I think that's it.
Great. So thank you so much, Karen, for going over the federal pass-through or federal block grants that can support civil legal aid's work around serving both those with opioid use disorder, OUD, and substance use disorder, SUD, but then also their family members and the larger community. So with that, and moving off of the grants matrix, we are going to talk about some of the resources that NLADA and the Justice and Government Project have put together that can help you either make your case, identify funding sources, or provide just a bit more information about how legal aid can partner in this. So the first that I wanted to point out is a co-created Justice and Government NLADA fact sheet. So this is a really quick 3-pager showing how civil legal aid is an important partner and helps those affected by the opioid crisis. It also provides a little overview of the four legal aid organizations that I previously mentioned that received the DOJOVC grant, and a bit more information about what they're doing with that. Below that is legalaidresearch.org. So this is a site that the NLADA maintains. It boasts over 400 needs assessments, reports, peer-reviewed studies that show legal aid helps. If you go to who served and then substance use disorder on the main page, you will be able to find all research related to it. And then last but not least is the Justice and Government Project Toolkit. This toolkit is a phenomenal resource for legal aid, policymakers, grant administrators, social service providers interested in learning more about how civil legal aid can make existing government programs more effective and more efficient. So it includes 4 different modules. It includes research on civil legal aid, an overview of the federal pass-through and block grants that can support civil legal aid. Here you will find the grants matrix that Karen previously mentioned, as well as in-depth FAQs. Module 3 features state examples. So in-depth looks at how states have used, let's say, VOCA funding or WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act funding to support their work. And then finally, additional tools. So if you have not yet checked out the toolkit, be sure to go check it out. It is truly an invaluable resource, and we are so grateful that Karen has put it together. All right, so moving on to federal funding. So like previously mentioned, you can find the grants forecasting guide in Module 2. It has the bird's eye view of the different grants, as well as the in-depth FAQs. You can download, that was the grants matrix. This is the forecasting guide. Sorry, everyone. So the forecasting guide provides information on how to identify those yet to be announced grants, how to identify partners, and see who the awards were previously made to. So if you find, let's say, a HUD grant that you're interested in going after, you can find a list of all of the previous awardees and maybe reach out and contact them and see how they've built their partnership, what they like about it, what they wish they knew, etc. So you can access it at the link below, and then you can also download a PDF of it on Legal Aid Resources. Legal Aid Resources is NLADA's big funding hub. It has over 250 federal funding opportunities that can support your work. If you go there, please sign up for email alerts. You will get a nice little note in your inbox saying that we have posted something, whether that be what you see right here, CNCS, AmeriCorps State and National, or AmeriCorps, or a forecasted grant. It's really important to get them as soon as they're released. I check the grants, grants.gov every morning to make sure that there's, to see if there's a new one released. So we're doing the heavy lifting for you, so you don't have to be doing that yourself. We also have, I will point out in the center of the screenshot under helpful tools, if you go to the drop-down menu, you will see both a making your case and also federal funding resources. There you can find our links to our curated Just Research newsletter, as well as links to, for example, Karen's grant matrix and the toolkit. So with that, we are now moving into our designated Q&A. I know that we I know that we had some questions answered and asked throughout the webinar. So I'm going to give you all a few minutes to think about what you want to know, what you wish we covered more in depth, or any follow-up questions. All right, and welcome back. We've got a few questions in store for us. Are there grants that support technology solutions and resources on state legal assistance web portals?
Yeah. So I love that question because I would love to see more activity on that score. So several of these block grants, there certainly is no prohibition. So as you develop your relationship with the state administrator of a particular block grant, it's a great question to ask. Are they open to that? But what I would put a big spotlight on is the VOCA Victim Assistance Rule, the 2016 rule, specifically has language urging use of technology to improve the delivery of victim services. So that is an area ripe with opportunity for you to propose technology solutions that, can reach further into rural areas, for example, or just make, expand access to clients anywhere, make the intake more efficient. There's lots of opportunities to think about it. And so with the VOCA victim assistance dollars, I would point out that OVC also for the last at least 2 years, maybe 3, has offered it's called Advancing the Use of Technology to Assist Victims of Crime. So you kind of have two bites at the apple, because you've got your state administrator and then there's a federal level OVC grant. And big shout out to Arizona Foundation for Legal Services and Education. They received one of those grants last year, and they're working on developing a really comprehensive, working with the courts, they're working with a whole range of service providers and the legal aid programs to develop a really comprehensive website with lots of bells and whistles. Also, New York, the VOCA administrator there has been a huge champion of both legal services and use of technology. Actually, so is Massachusetts. There's some good examples. But anyway, I strongly encourage, exploring that. Online interviews. Oh, that would be so wonderful if we could multiply and spread that kind of tool.
Awesome. And then I'm going to just put a plug in for one of the upcoming panels at the NLADA annual conference in Detroit in just a short month. So Lester Bird from Pew Charitable Trust is going to be chairing a session on lead portals, and in it he will also be talking about replication efforts. So if you are coming, I highly recommend, and you're interested in that particular topic, I recommend checking it out once we announce the schedule. All right, so we have another question here. Do you think there will be funding from opioid settlements with state attorney generals that will include legal services? I see Karen smile, so let's maybe turn it on over to her.
Yeah, so there's certainly precedent for state AGs using settlement funds to address the underlying harms and generalized harms that flowed from the particular subject of the litigation. So I don't see any reason why opioid would be different in that regard. I think it's important to think about legal services as not a separate, it's not about robbing Peter to pay Paul, but how legal services are an essential service to prevention and recovery and essential partners in that work. So with that cautionary note, because I think generally the settlement money is not going to be enough to do what a lot of us think needs to be done, but it does seem, given the evidence base that Casey went through, the case that you were able to make, and if you can partner with other service providers, I think a meeting with your state AG is a great idea.
And we do know that the Arizona Foundation for Legal Services and Education has had conversations with Arizona's Attorney General, and if you, similar to them, are interested in organizing around the idea for funds or something along those lines, please reach out to us, and we can maybe connect you or talk you through it or provide technical assistance around that. And it is also important to note that if and when these are announced, we will post about it on legalaidresources.org. And if there's a lot of interest around it, we might even host a webinar or a teleconference with those who are interested in organizing and strategizing. All right, we have another question. How do we find pass-through grant opportunities offered in our state? Karen, that one looks.
Sure. So your starting point is that grants matrix. It's a curated list of those block grants, pass-through funds that either expressly say legal services are an allowable use, or the language is broad enough that you can surely make the case. And the grants matrix really points you in the direction of all the background information you need to get yourself educated on what the options are and how to find the state administrator of each one. And usually, in almost all cases, some examples where those particular block grant funds were used for to support legal aid or court-based services.
And we have another question. Are all of these funding sources strictly limited to opioid use? Can any of them be used for problems connected to methamphetamine? So the ones that are specific to opioid use are the ones with opioid in the title of the direct discretionary federal grants. The HUD grant, the Resident Opportunity and Self-Sufficiency, is not strictly labeled or strictly limited to opioids. It is broader in that applicants may address up to 3 areas. One of them includes substance abuse. And then the federal pass-through funds are not limited.
But it's also, read the solicitations carefully, because often they recognize that it's a small target to hit if you have to say no to people with a substance use disorder that's not opioid related. So in most instances, it will allow, the funding will allow for both.
And then where can we find models of successful grants or links to successful grantee contacts? It would be helpful to know more about the elements of successful applications. So you can find these either through the grants matrix. There is a column of legal aid examples. You can also find these if you go to the grants forecasting document. There's links that can bring you to the specific agency pages where you can find previous grantees. And then from there, if their contact information isn't listed on their website, you can always reach out to NLADA and we can directly connect you so you can share resources and information. If you would like us to do that, send us an email to resourcedesk@NLADA. That information is on the next slide. And we don't have any other questions. That being said, I will put in a plug for our upcoming webinar, which is on October 24th at 3 p.m. I do have confirmation that is the correct time, and that one will be with Legal Aid of West Virginia. And before you go, please don't go quite yet. If you liked what we had to say, and if you like NLADA or the Justice and Government Project in general, please fill out our survey. It should take approximately 15 to 20 minutes, and it asks you questions about your experience with our training and technical assistance, like these webinars, conferences, and so forth, and if and how it has affected the way in which you apply for funding or in your success for those funding opportunities. We also have a curated research newsletter. It puts together all of the top research at the moment, legislative updates, information about funding, where to find data, and more. And you can find it in your inbox every month if you sign up at the link here. You can also find our past issues on the Legal Aid Resources website. And our opioid one will be released on October 7th, giving you plenty of time to sign up. And then if you are seeking technical assistance, you can reach us at the resource desk email or by emailing klash@american.edu. We can definitely help you in strategizing and so forth. And then finally, on the topic of vistas, one of NLADA's VISTA members has put together this phenomenal survey on trying to get information about how legal aid, both public defenders and also civil legal aid, are working to combat the opioid crisis. It's a very short survey. It should only take maximum 3 to 5 minutes. And we would greatly appreciate it if you could take it, and that will help us in getting the field around, getting a sense of what the field looks like. All right, and then all of the links will be on the NLADA webinar page, and as well as the PowerPoint. So if you don't want to, for instance, type in any of the URLs, you can definitely access it that way, and that should be on later today. Great. So with that, thank you so much, Karen, for coming to NLADA and speaking with us. And thank you all for attending. We greatly appreciate it. And if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to us. Our contact information was on one of the first slides. All right, thank you.